Last night, the Game 7 between the Brooklyn Nets and the Milwaukee Bucks was truly one of the most amazing games that I've watched in a long time in the NBA. This game was insanely fun to watch. Kevin Durant hitting that incredible shot at the end of regulation with his foot just on the line to tie it up 109-109. The incredible defense of both teams in the double overtime, some big shots missed by some big-time players, and ultimately the Bucks clutching it up and coming away with the victory, and just the entire game was so fun to watch, and ultimately this was the best series that we've seen in the playoffs so far this year. Now, if you guys have been watching my channel, you know that before this series I made a video on my hot take on why I think the Bucks will win this series, and ultimately that was a very hot take. Tons of people disagreed with me. This became my most disliked video with 12 dislikes, and there were lots of people in the comments hating on my take. So let's just take a moment to look back at all of these comments, and let me just say that I hate to do this, but I'm going to give myself credit here. I was right. I made the bold take that this would happen. Tons of people clowned me because of my take, but ultimately I was right. So yeah, I'm just gonna take a moment here and leave this up on the screen because this feels so good, man. Like, all of these people doubted me, but I was ultimately right about this series. It was really close, and obviously the Nets were shorthanded at times without James Harden, and at the end without Kyrie. But I'm gonna take this moment and just look back at all of these comments and all the people that doubted this hot take that I had. So anyway, what I'm gonna be doing in today's video is just looking back at this series, giving some overall analysis, looking at why the Bucks were able to ultimately win it, some things that both teams could have done differently to succeed at a higher level, and ultimately my overall analysis of the series. So let's get into it. Now, before we do, if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. I'm posting tons of content during the playoffs right now, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any new videos. With that being said, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is just how dominant Giannis Antetokounmpo was in this series. One of the things that I talked about in that hot take video where I talked about why the Bucks would win is how the Nets really didn't have a matchup for Giannis, and they could try to shrink the floor a little bit, but ultimately they didn't do that too much, and I thought the Bucks would shoot the three well this series, which they didn't. They only shot 30% from three. They had an atrocious shooting series, but they still didn't shrink the floor enough, and they still didn't even have what it takes, despite the team not hitting threes and not being able to space the floor that much. They still didn't shrink the floor that much. I really think they should have, but they didn't, and they still allowed Giannis to work in one-on-one matchups. They didn't bring enough help, and he was able to dominate. There's a lot of things I think the Nets could have done to stop him a little bit more. One is obviously, like I mentioned, shrink the floor a little bit more, and another is play Nicholas Claxton more. Like, this dude right here is so underrated. He is the best defender on this team. You heard it here first. He is by far actually the best defender on this Brooklyn Nets team, and he actually did really well guarding Giannis in the first two games of this series, but they stopped playing him after that. I'm not really sure why. They went with a more smaller lineup. Blake Griffin did a pretty good job at times of guarding Giannis, but still nearly wasn't as good as Claxton defensively. He should have played more, and it would help the Nets try to disrupt Giannis a little bit more. But overall in this series, Giannis just completely dominated. It's a big legacy booster for him right now. Like, his legacy was on the line in this series, and he came up big despite all the free throw struggles, only shooting 48% from the line in this series, and also getting a lot of hate when the Nets were up in this series from other fans and people just in general just throwing hate at Giannis. He ended up finishing the series with 32 points per game, 13 rebounds per game, and 4 assists per game on a very good 58% field goal percentage. He absolutely dominated at the rim, and like I mentioned, the Nets just didn't have what it takes defensively to stop him, so I was absolutely right about that, the thing that I talked about in my video. Overall, Giannis shot 59% true shooting as well. It really took a hit with all those free throws and some of those missed threes, but in general in the series, sometimes he was not aggressive enough and settled for jump shots, but mostly down the stretch, he was very aggressive, attacked the rim. He knew that this Nets team wasn't able to guard him, just like I did, and because of this, he was able to dominate, just attack the rim a ton, and overall, he was so fun to watch in this series. He was so dominant, and he deserves 100% credit for this Bucks win. The next thing I want to talk about here is the transition game, and we all know that the Bucks, especially because they're led by Giannis, kind of their main way of success is the transition game. And honestly, in this series, they didn't even shoot that efficiently. They only shot 45% in transition, which is pretty bad. But in terms of comparing them to the Brooklyn Nets, they absolutely dominated the transition game. They, first of all, just did it a ton more. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel, especially with teams like the Phoenix Suns and how they've been able to succeed in the transition game in the playoffs so far. And like I mentioned, the Bucks, they didn't necessarily do it that well, but they still did it way more than the Brooklyn Nets, and because of this, it was a success for them. They got out in transition 17.5% of the time throughout the entire playoffs so far, where the Brooklyn Nets have only done it 11.5% of the time. This is a big difference right here, especially when you have Giannis on your team. It's going to be a lot better when you get out in transition. Ultimately, throughout the playoffs, the Bucks are scoring 20 points per game in transition, compared to the Nets' 12 points per game in transition. So when you look at how the Bucks were able to push the pace a lot more, and you really saw how, especially in those last two games, the Nets' offense was too one-dimensional. It was way too focused around Kevin Durant, and despite his incredibly historic, dominant playoff series that he had in this series right here against the Milwaukee Bucks, and I'm going to be talking about him a little bit later on this video too, just giving credit to how good KD was in this series, the Nets still needed to get out in transition more if they wanted to succeed, because this Bucks defense was playing very well as an overall unit in this series. They played amazing perimeter defense, especially down the stretch, did a great job of doing things like fighting through screens, cutting off passing lanes, getting matchups that they wanted, and overall just making someone other than Kevin Durant beat them if the Nets wanted to win this series, and ultimately they couldn't do that. I'll be talking about James Harden a little bit later on as well, but when you look at a guy like James Harden, he was playing injured for the last 3 games of this series, and you could see how he really could not push the pace. There was this one time where he got the ball, and you could tell that usually if he was playing 100%, he would have pushed the ball up the floor, made a nice pass maybe to the corner for a 3 or something like that, or attacked the rim, but he literally brought the ball back and allowed the entire Bucks defense and the Nets offense to set up and play just regular basketball and set up their offense. The Nets really didn't push the pace enough in this series. If Harden was 100% healthy, it would have been a lot easier for them to do so, but overall the Bucks dominated the transition game. This was a huge factor in this series. So let me expand a little bit more on James Harden. So we know that 42 seconds into game 1, he pulls his hamstring and has to miss the next 4 games, and obviously this is a huge blow for the Brooklyn Nets. That goes without saying. If he's fully healthy, they probably win the series. Same thing with Kyrie. If they are fully healthy, they probably win this series. But ultimately, when Harden was playing in game 5, 6, and 7, you could really tell that he was playing injured, and he didn't play well at all. He shot 5 of 26 from 3 throughout those games, which is less than 20%, and a combined 11 of 36 from the field, which is less than 31%, which is absolutely atrocious for a field goal percentage. I talked about how he wasn't fully healthy. You could tell that he had no explosiveness, he wasn't pushing the pace at all, and he settled for way too much ISO game. And we know that when he played with the Houston Rockets, this was obviously his go-to, things like the little step back, but it absolutely was not working for him in this series. And a ball-dominant playoff style like that, you can tell that it's, especially for Harden, it's not going to work for team success. And he was still a very good passer for these 3 games, but you could tell that he was settling a lot. He had no explosiveness, didn't push the pace, and ultimately shot horribly. Now, part of it too is how he was really well defended. Jrue Holiday did not have a good offensive series, but defensively he was just simply amazing. I mean, he guarded James Harden mostly for these last 3 games. He was absolutely the primary matchup on him for most of the time, and he did a fantastic job. He made it really tough on him, really pressed up on him on the perimeter, didn't allow Harden to beat him off the dribble once, and it was pretty easy to do that since, again, Harden was playing pretty much with one hamstring. But overall, Jrue Holiday held him to 3 of 10 from the field and 1 of 8 from 3, and just overall made it so tough on him to even just get open sometimes. He did a great job of doing things like fighting through screens and making sure that Harden was not the guy that was going to step up and help KD. Overall, Giannis guarded him a little bit too, and he did pretty well as well, especially even though Giannis is a little bit taller and you might think he's a little bit uncoordinated, he definitely isn't. He was able to guard James Harden on the perimeter very much. He did a good job, held him to 5 of 13 from the field and 4 of of 12 from 3, so pretty much all of the shots that James Harden took against Giannis were threes, but Giannis did a great job of contesting them, making sure that Harden wasn't able to operate easily against him, and just overall, Harden was not a factor in the last 3 games of this series. He needed to be better. He also needed to be fully healthy, but if he was fully healthy, it'd be a whole different story, but overall, he was well defended and wasn't able to step up. The last thing I want to talk about is how, even despite the injuries that the Brooklyn Nets had, they were still able to be in this series because of just simply how good Kevin Durant was. This man here deserves absolutely no slander at all. I don't care if he airballed the last shot. He was tired as all living hell. He just left it all out on the floor. He played the whole game in Game 5, 48 minutes. He played 40 minutes in Game 6, would have played the entire game if the Bucks weren't winning by 20 at the end, and then played a grand total of 53 minutes in Game 7, every single minute, including all of overtime. Just absolutely insane stuff from KD, and throughout the series, he averaged a grand total of 35 points per game, 11 rebounds, 5 assists. In that Game 5, he became the first player in NBA history to have more than 45 points, more than 15 rebounds, and more than 10 assists in a playoff game. Just absolutely insane stuff from KD. Had a true shooting of 60% throughout this series, and ultimately just left it all out on the floor. Like, I give this man so much credit. Some people in the past may have considered me a Kevin Durant hater because of how I haven't really ranked him well throughout this season, and I found him a little bit overrated because he's not a great defender anymore, but he proved that he's easily still the best scorer in the league today, and definitely still a top 3 player in the NBA. The fact that he's able to do this too, coming off of an Achilles injury, is just absolutely insane. I just give so much credit to Kevin Durant. He was insanely fun to watch in this series. Now, one thing I think the Bucks could have done better, and I think down the stretch, this was just common sense, but they should have put Giannis on Kevin Durant. They could have Giannis guarding Kevin Durant because he's one of the very rare players in the NBA that has the combination of height, length, skill, coordination, and athleticism to even have a chance of guarding Kevin Durant. And throughout this series, he only guarded him for 6 minutes, but when he did, he held him to only 5 of 15 from the field and 1 of 7 from 3. And honestly, they should have had Giannis on KD way more. They could have put Jrue Holiday as the main help defender. He's a very good help defender, as we know. He does a great job. He has great hands, awareness, gets a lot of steals. And then if you're worried about who you have behind you protecting the rim, you still got Brook Lopez, who last year made the all-defensive team. He's not very good in the pick and roll, but he's very good at protecting the rim, and if he stays out of the pick and roll, he's going to do a great job. So the Bucks defense could have operated much easier if they just put Giannis on Kevin Durant. Don't get me wrong, PJ Tucker and Jrue Holiday played amazing defense on KD this series, but they're just simply not tall enough to guard him. Like, this is literally just common sense. They are amazing defenders, but they just simply aren't tall enough. PJ Tucker's only 6'6", and Kevin Durant is 7 feet tall, and he did an amazing job of guarding him. Actually held him to 35 of 77 from the field, around 45% from the field in this series, and guarded him for 59 minutes throughout the entire series. But Giannis still would have had just a much easier job than PJ Tucker did if he was able to guard Kevin Durant. PJ Tucker, again, could have been a help defender. Same thing with Jrue Holiday. He held him to about 50% from the field, KD that is, throughout the series, guarded him for 11 minutes. But both of these guys, they're just not tall enough to guard Kevin Durant. That is just common sense right there. They should have been help defenders. Giannis should have been on KD, and this series could have ended in 5 or 6 games if this happened. I honestly think that if the Bucks went with my matchups that I mentioned in that video with my hot take on why the Brooklyn Nets would lose in this series to the Milwaukee Bucks, if the Nets were fully healthy, they had their big 3, and the Bucks put Jrue Holiday on Kyrie, PJ Tucker on Harden, and Giannis on Kevin Durant, I honestly think that this series would be like 50-50. Obviously, if the Nets had Kyrie and Harden fully the entire series, they would have won, but I think if I was coaching this Bucks team and I went with these different matchups and played a different style of defense than Mike Budenholzer does, I honestly think they would have had a better chance here. But ultimately, they still did squeak it out. Shout out to Giannis, man. This man, same thing as KD. This man just left it all out on the floor, proved all his haters wrong, and this series was incredible to watch. Such great entertainment, and that's going to be at the end of today's video. Thank you all for watching. Comment down below what you think of this series and who you had winning it if you were wrong that you thought the Brooklyn Nets would win, or if you were like me, you had the hot take that they were going to win, and you were ultimately right. Thank you all for watching this video. As I mentioned, if you're new, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you all next video.